The city never really slept, but in the quiet hours before dawn, New York sometimes breathed differently. Streetlights hummed softly, storefront gates rested like tired eyelids, and the wind carried stories no one ever wrote down. If you listened closely, really closely, you might hear the echo of footsteps from decades ago, walking confidently down a Brooklyn sidewalk. Those footsteps belonged to a man who would become a legend, a warning, and a mystery all at once. His name was John Gotti. Long before newspapers shouted it in bold letters, before television cameras followed his every move, John was just a kid in a crowded apartment, one of many children squeezed into a world that felt too small for big dreams. He grew up in East New York, Brooklyn, where life moved fast and hard lessons arrived early. The neighborhood had its own rules, unwritten but deeply understood. Loyalty mattered, respect mattered even more, and weakness, once spotted, was never forgotten. John wasn't born powerful. He didn't come from money or privilege. What he had instead was presence. Even as a young man, people noticed him when he entered a room. He spoke with confidence, listened carefully, and remembered favors. In a place where people were often ignored, being seen meant everything. John learned that early, and he never forgot it. School never held his attention for long. The streets taught faster, louder lessons. He watched older men who seemed untouchable, men who dressed sharply and moved with purpose. They didn't rush. They didn't explain themselves. People stepped aside when they walked by. To a young John Gotti, they looked like answers to questions he hadn't yet learned how to ask. As the years passed, John found himself drawn closer to that world. It wasn't sudden, and it wasn't dramatic. It happened in quiet conversations, small errands, and favors that slowly grew heavier. He learned when to speak and when to stay silent. He learned that reputation could be stronger than fists, and that a smile, used at the right moment, could open more doors than force ever could. By the time he was a young adult, John was known in certain circles. Not famous yet, but known. People trusted him with responsibility. He dressed well even when money was tight, as if clothing were armor. Neighbors whispered about his confidence, his style, the way he carried himself like someone already certain of his future. But certainty can be dangerous. Every step forward pulls you deeper into choices that are harder to undo. John's loyalty to his associates grew stronger, and so did the expectations placed on him. In that world, loyalty was everything, but it was never free. Every favor came with a memory. Every memory came with a debt. At home, life moved differently. Family dinners, familiar voices, the comfort of routine. John loved his family deeply, and that love shaped many of his decisions. He believed that providing, protecting, and commanding respect were forms of care. It was a belief shared by many men of his time and place, though few would admit it openly. As night fell over the city, John often found himself awake, thinking. The streets outside whispered promises and warnings in equal measure. Power, once tasted, was hard to forget. He wasn't chasing fame then. He was chasing something quieter. Control over his own destiny in a world that rarely offered it. Opportunities came wrapped in risk. A chance to prove himself. A chance to rise. Each decision nudged him further from the ordinary life he might have lived and closer to a path that only moved forward. Turning back was never discussed. In that world, forward motion was survival. People began to talk. Not loudly, not publicly, but enough. John Gotti was reliable. John Gotti was bold. John Gotti didn't panic. Those qualities mattered more than strength or size. They marked him as someone to watch. And so, beneath the steady glow of streetlights and the endless murmur of the city, a story quietly took shape. No headlines yet. No cameras. Just a man, a neighborhood, and a future forming step by step. The city kept breathing, unaware that one of its most talked about names was still just a whisper, walking through the night, believing without hesitation that his best days were still ahead. By the time John Gotti reached his late 20s, the city no longer felt quite so large. The same streets that once overwhelmed him now felt familiar, almost personal, like old friends who knew his moods. He understood their rhythms, The busy mornings, the tense afternoons, the long nights where conversations mattered more than noise. In those hours, deals were made, trust was tested, and futures quietly shifted. John had begun working more closely with men who carried real influence. They weren't loud about it. Power rarely needed volume. These men noticed how John handled pressure. When things went wrong, he didn't panic. When plans changed, he adjusted. And most importantly, when someone placed trust in him, he treated it like something sacred. That reputation followed him everywhere. He learned the importance of appearances. A well-tailored suit, polished shoes, a calm expression. These were not vanity to John. They were signals. In his world, how you looked told people how seriously to take you. And people took John Gotti very seriously. Even those who didn't like him couldn't ignore him. At the same time, danger quietly increased. The higher you climbed, the more eyes watched your every move. Rivals measured you. Authorities noticed patterns. Even friends began to wonder how far you intended to go. John knew this, but he believed confidence could outrun caution. He trusted his instincts, and more often than not, they rewarded him. There were moments when the weight of it all pressed down on him. Late nights when the city seemed too quiet, when the consequences of his choices drifted into his thoughts. But morning always came, and with it, responsibility. John didn't dwell on doubts. He believed hesitation was a weakness others could exploit. His family remained his anchor. At home, he was not a rising figure or a man of influence. He was a husband, a father, a son. Those roles grounded him. He wanted his children to see strength, stability, and pride. He wanted them to feel protected in a world he knew could be unforgiving. In his mind, everything he did was part of that mission. As years passed, John became more visible within the organization he served. He wasn't the most powerful, but he was becoming one of the most trusted. That distinction mattered. Power could be taken. Trust had to be earned and defended. John defended his fiercely. Then came moments that changed how others viewed him. Decisions made under pressure. Risks taken when safer paths existed. Each time, John stepped forward instead of back. People noticed. Whispers grew louder. His name carried weight now, spoken with a mix of admiration and caution. The city itself seemed to respond to his rise. Doors opened more easily. Conversations stopped when he entered rooms. People listened. He didn't demand respect. He expected it. That expectation shaped every interaction. Those who met it earned his favor. Those who didn't rarely forgot the encounter. But with rising influence came growing tension. The world John moved in was built on balance, and balance was fragile. Alliances shifted. Loyalties were tested. Decisions made far above his level began to ripple downward, affecting everyone beneath. John watched carefully, learning not just how power was gained, but how it was lost. He began to understand that ambition alone wasn't enough. Timing mattered, patience mattered, and above all, perception mattered. Being seen as capable was good. Being seen as indispensable was better. John adjusted his approach, choosing moments carefully, speaking less but meaning more when he did. Late one evening, as he stood outside a familiar building, watching traffic flow like a living river, John sensed that his life was nearing a turning point. Not a sudden one, but an inevitable one. The kind you feel before it arrives. The kind that changes everything. He didn't know exactly what form it would take. No one ever does. But he knew one thing with certainty. The quiet days were ending. The whispers would soon become conversations. And the conversations, headlines. The city kept moving, unaware of how close it was to speaking his name out loud. And John Gotti, standing calmly beneath the glow of a streetlight, straightened his jacket, lifted his chin, and stepped forward, ready for whatever came next. The turning point didn't arrive with sirens or shouting. It came quietly, the way most life-changing moments do, disguised as just another conversation in a familiar place. John Gotti was sitting among men who had known him for years, men who had watched him grow from a confident young runner into someone whose words carried weight. The room smelled of coffee and cigarette smoke, and the mood was calm. but beneath it ran an undercurrent of evaluation. Every glance, every pause, meant something. John spoke carefully that night. Not too much, not too little. He had learned that silence, used correctly, could be louder than speech. When he did talk, people leaned in. He wasn't trying to impress anyone anymore. He was past that stage. Now, he was positioning himself, whether consciously or not, for a larger role. Outside, Brooklyn carried on as usual. Couples walked home from late dinners. Taxi lights blurred past intersections. Somewhere, a radio played an old song that sounded like nostalgia itself. But inside that room, futures were being weighed. Trust, after all, was the most valuable currency in that world, and John had been quietly collecting it for years. Soon after, responsibility found him whether he asked for it or not. More people answered to him. More problems landed at his feet. He handled them with a steady hand, always calm, always composed. Even when tension rose, John's expression rarely changed. That composure became part of his reputation. People said if John Gotti said something would be handled, it would be. With greater responsibility came greater visibility. He was no longer just known within a tight circle. His name began to travel, hopping from neighborhood to neighborhood, crossing lines that once kept stories contained. Law enforcement started paying closer attention, though John remained confident. He believed that if you acted openly enough, confidently enough, people would mistake boldness for innocence. He enjoyed being seen. That was one of the differences between John and many others like him. Where others preferred shadows, John preferred light. He didn't hide his tailored suits or his confident stride. To him, visibility was power. If people saw you every day, you became part of the scenery. Familiar, almost harmless. At home, life continued with its own rhythm. Family dinners, laughter, routine disagreements over small things. John treasured those moments more than he admitted. They reminded him why he pushed so hard, why he accepted risks others avoided. In his mind, he was building something lasting, not just influence, but security for those he loved. Still, cracks began to appear at the edges of his world. Disagreements among higher-ups, old alliances strained by pride and ambition. John watched all of it closely, saying little, storing information like a chess player planning several moves ahead. He understood that power struggles rarely announced themselves. They revealed their intentions slowly, through patterns and pressure. There were nights when sleep came late. John would sit quietly, thinking not about what he had gained, but about what might be coming. He knew that rising too fast could be dangerous, but slowing down felt impossible. Momentum, once built, demanded direction. One particular decision, calculated, deliberate, set him firmly apart from many others. It showed not only confidence, but resolve. After that, people stopped wondering whether John Gotti belonged where he was. They began wondering how far he would go. The media had not yet caught on, but the foundations were being laid. A man who dressed like a star, spoke like a leader, and moved like someone who believed the city itself bent slightly in his direction. John didn't seek a crown, but the shape of one was beginning to form around him. As the decade edged forward, New York changed, and so did John. He was sharper now, more patient, more aware of the cost of every move. He understood that the path ahead would not forgive mistakes easily, but he also believed that history favored those bold enough to shape it. On a cool evening, standing near a busy intersection, John paused and watched the city flow past him. Thousands of lives moving at once, each convinced of its own importance. He smiled faintly. Somewhere deep inside, he felt certain of one thing. His story was no longer just beginning. It was accelerating. The acceleration felt subtle at first, like a train leaving the station so smoothly you barely noticed the movement. John Gotti felt it in the way people deferred to him without being asked, in how conversations paused until he spoke, in how problems seemed to land on his desk by default. He hadn't announced himself as a leader. Leadership had simply settled on his shoulders, heavy but familiar. The world around him grew more complicated. Old rules still applied, but new pressures tested them daily. There were expectations now, unspoken ones, that John sensed even before they were voiced. He responded by becoming more deliberate, every word chosen carefully, every promise weighed before it was given. He understood that, in his position, certainty mattered more than speed. He cultivated relationships the way others collected trophies. A remembered birthday here, a well-timed favor there. People felt seen when they dealt with John, and that made them loyal. Loyalty, he believed, was built not on fear, but on consistency. If you knew where you stood with him, you could relax. And relaxed people talked. John listened. The city, meanwhile, was changing its tone. The late 70s brought a different energy to New York. Grittier, louder, restless. Headlines spoke of chaos and decline. But beneath that noise, there was opportunity for those who knew how to navigate it. John navigated it with confidence. He moved through social clubs, restaurants, and street corners like a man with a map no one else could see. With increased visibility came attention he couldn't fully control. He noticed unfamiliar faces lingering a little too long, questions asked twice in different ways. John adjusted, but he didn't retreat. Retreating, he felt, invited suspicion. Instead, he leaned into normalcy, being seen, being known, becoming part of the city's everyday rhythm. At home, his children were growing, and that reality tugged at him more than he admitted. He wanted to be present, to be remembered as strong and reliable. He told himself that everything he was building would one day protect them from the uncertainty he'd known growing up. It was a comforting thought, one he returned to often. Tensions within the organization continued to rise. Decisions made far above John's level sent ripples through the ranks. Some leaders ruled from a distance, others through fear. John watched, learned, and quietly disagreed. He believed leadership should be visible, personal. A leader should be someone people could look in the eye. That belief set him apart. It also put him on a path few could avoid once they stepped onto it. There were moments when John sensed that others were measuring him, not as an ally, but as a potential rival. The realization didn't anger him. It focused him. He became even more careful, even more composed. If he was being judged, he intended to pass without showing effort. One evening, during a gathering that felt casual on the surface, John realized just how much the balance had shifted. A decision was needed. People looked to him instinctively. No vote. No annoncement. Just expectation. John spoke calmly, offered a solution, and watched as it was accepted without challenge. The room relaxed. The matter was settled. Later, walking alone beneath the glow of neon lights, John reflected on that moment. Power, he realized, often revealed itself only after it had already taken hold. You didn't grab it. You noticed one day that it was there. But power came with weight. The higher you stood, the more careful your footing had to be. Mistakes echoed louder. Enemies watched closer. John understood that the coming years would demand more than confidence. They would demand resilience. Still, he felt ready. As traffic hummed past and the city breathed around him, John adjusted his pace, unhurried, assured. Somewhere ahead, unseen but inevitable, were choices that would define him forever. He didn't know how the story would end, but he was certain of one thing. He would not be forgotten. The years that followed felt heavier, as if the air itself carried expectation. John Gotti was no longer simply rising. He had arrived at a place where every movement mattered. People watched not just what he did, but how he did it. His calm confidence became his signature, a steady rhythm in a world that often spun out of control. He spent more time listening than speaking. That was how he stayed ahead. In quiet corners of social clubs and back rooms of restaurants, he absorbed the mood of the city and the shifting loyalties within his circle. People talked when they felt comfortable, and John had a way of making even tense conversations feel manageable. He nodded, asked simple questions, remembered details others forgot. Over time, people began to assume he already knew everything, and often he did. The media still hadn't fully discovered him, but the groundwork was there. His style set him apart. The sharp suits, the confident walk, the way he greeted people by name. It all created an image that lingered in memory. John understood image instinctively. He believed that if people saw strength, They felt safer aligning themselves with it. At home, the contrast was striking. The same man who commanded attention outside moved more quietly among his family. He laughed more there, relaxed. Those moments mattered deeply to him. They reminded him that beyond the strategies and negotiations, there was a life he wanted to preserve. He told himself that balance was possible, that a man could be both respected and present. But balance is fragile. Pressures continued to mount within the organization. Leadership styles clashed. Pride complicated decisions that should have been simple. John sensed instability at the top, though few spoke of it openly. He didn't rush to take sides. Instead, he positioned himself as reliable, steady, someone others could lean on when uncertainty crept in. That steadiness made him indispensable. When difficult situations arose, John was often the one asked to smooth things over, to bring calm where tension threatened to spill into chaos. He had a gift for making people feel heard without giving away too much. It wasn't manipulation, it was control through understanding. Still, there were moments when the future felt uncertain even to him. Late at night, when the city quieted and the glow of streetlights softened, John sometimes wondered how far this path would go. He knew the risks. He wasn't naive, but turning back felt impossible now. Too many people depended on him. Too many expectations rested on his shoulders. A series of events, small on their own, significant together, began to change the atmosphere. Conversations grew shorter. Decisions took longer. Trust, once abundant, became selective. John noticed who hesitated when speaking to him, who watched instead of engaging. He filed it all away, understanding that awareness was his greatest protection. Then came a moment when everything sharpened. A dispute that could not be ignored. Opinions divided. The room felt tense in a way that made even seasoned men uneasy. When eyes turned toward John, he felt the weight of choice settle fully onto him. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't dramatize the moment. He spoke plainly, offering a path forward that emphasized unity and stability. The reaction was immediate. The tension eased. Heads nodded. The matter moved on. Afterward, someone clapped him on the shoulder and said, almost casually, "You handled that well." It was meant as praise, but John heard something else beneath it, acknowledgement. From that point on, there was no pretending. John Gotti was no longer just part of the inner circle. He was shaping it. As he stepped out into the night, the city greeted him with its familiar sounds. Distant traffic, voices echoing off brick walls, the low hum of something always happening somewhere. John took it all in, feeling the momentum beneath his feet. He didn't know that history was already beginning to write his name more boldly. He only knew that the path ahead was narrowing, focusing, demanding clarity. And John Gotti, steady and self-assured, continued forward, unaware that the quiet before the storm was almost over. The quiet didn't last. Never does. In John Gotti's world, calm was usually a sign that something was shifting beneath the surface. He felt it in the pauses between conversations, in the way certain names were spoken more carefully than before. The balance of power above him was no longer steady, and everyone could sense it, even if few dared to say it out loud. John didn't rush to fill the silence. He understood something many didn't. When structures weaken, patience becomes a form of strength. He continued doing what he had always done, showing up, listening, keeping things running smoothly. While others argued over authority, John focused on reliability. In uncertain times, people gravitate toward what feels solid, and John felt solid. He became more visible than ever, moving through the city with the same confidence that had always defined him, but now it carried a different weight. People didn't just notice him, they studied him. The way he spoke, the way he dressed, the way he never seemed flustered. To some, he represented stability. To others, inevitability. The media began circling closer, though they didn't yet understand what they were seeing. A man with movie star confidence in a world that usually avoided cameras. John didn't shy away. If anything, he leaned in. He believed that if people were going to look, he might as well control what they saw. Confidence, after all, disarmed suspicion better than secrecy ever could. At home, however, the growing attention brought tension. His wife noticed the phone ringing more often, the late nights stretching longer. John reassured her with calm words and familiar routines, but deep down, he knew the risks were increasing. He told himself he was careful. He believed preparation could outpace danger. As months passed, events began to move faster. Disagreements at the top hardened into fractures. Decisions once made quietly now sparked debate. John watched carefully, aware that moments like these didn't come often, and when they did, they reshaped everything. Then came the shift. Not a dramatic announcement, not a public declaration, just a series of changes that, taken together, altered the landscape completely. John found himself consulted first, deferred to instinctively, trusted without question. It wasn't something he demanded. It simply happened. With that trust came responsibility on a new scale. The consequences of mistakes were no longer personal, they were collective. John felt the weight of that deeply. He became more measured, more thoughtful. He slept less, thought more. Every decision echoed. Yet, despite the pressure, he thrived. There was something about the role that suited him. Leadership didn't feel like a mask he had to wear. It felt like an extension of who he already was. He believed in visibility, in being present, in knowing the people around him not as pieces on a board, but as individuals with strengths and limits. People responded to that. Loyalty deepened. Confidence spread. The city seemed to recognize it too. When John entered a room, conversations shifted naturally in his direction. When he walked down the street, people noticed, not out of fear, but fascination. He had become a symbol of something larger than himself. A man who looked like he belonged at the center of things. But symbols attract attention, and attention brings pressure. Law enforcement scrutiny intensified, though John remained outwardly unfazed. He believed that acting normal, too normal to question, was his best defense. He kept his routines predictable, his demeanor relaxed. He understood that fear could create mistakes, and mistakes invited trouble. Still, the stakes were undeniable now. There was no stepping back into anonymity. John Gotti's name was being spoken more openly, more frequently, carried power, admiration, and warning all at once. One evening, after a long day of conversations and decisions, John found himself alone for a rare moment. He sat quietly, reflecting not on how far he'd come, but on how narrow the road ahead had become. Choices were fewer now, but each one mattered more. He thought about his children, about the legacy he was creating whether he wanted to or not. He believed he was building something strong, something enduring. Yet somewhere beneath that belief lived a quieter thought, one he rarely allowed himself to examine too closely. The thought that power, once fully claimed, never lets go gently. The next phase of his life was already unfolding. He could feel it in the city's energy, in the tightening focus of attention around him. The era of whispers was over. The era of headlines was approaching. John stood, adjusted his jacket, and stepped back into the noise of New York. The lights were brighter now, the eyes sharper, the expectations heavier. But his stride didn't change. He walked forward as he always had, confident, composed, convinced that he could shape the future just as he had shaped his rise. And for the moment, the city seemed to agree. By now, John Gotti no longer measured time in days or weeks. He measured it in moments. Moments when the room leaned toward him, moments when silence followed his words, moments when he felt the weight of the city settle, just briefly, on his shoulders. New York had a way of choosing its characters, and whether John liked it or not, he had become one of them. The attention was no longer subtle. Reporters began lingering outside courthouses and restaurants, notebooks ready, eyes alert. They didn't fully understand the world John moved in, but they sensed a story forming. An instinct told them he was at its center. John noticed them too. He didn't hide. He smiled, nodded, adjusted his cufflinks. To him, fear was the real danger. Confidence, on the other hand, could bend perception. People started calling him things, nicknames, labels, symbols. Some said them with admiration, others with warning. John didn't repeat them aloud, but he heard them. He understood that names had power. Once given, they were difficult to take back. Inside his circle, expectations continued to rise. Leadership was no longer theoretical. It was daily, constant, demanding. People came to him not just for decisions, but for reassurance. They wanted to know that someone steady was holding the wheel. John provided that steadiness. Even when pressure mounted, his voice stayed calm, his posture relaxed. Yet privately, the responsibility weighed on him more than he let on. Late nights stretched longer. Sleep came in fragments. When he did rest, his mind replayed conversations, searched for missed signals. Leadership, he learned, was less about control and more about vigilance. At home, he tried to keep life normal. Family dinners, familiar jokes, quiet moments that reminded him of simpler times. But the outside world crept in regardless. His children were growing older, more aware. He wondered what they noticed, what they sensed in the pauses and phone calls. He wanted them to feel safe, not burdened by the gravity of his position. The city itself seemed to react to his presence now. When John entered a restaurant, conversations shifted. Some people watched openly, curious. Others pretended not to notice, which told him just as much. He had become part of the city's mythology while still very much alive, still walking its sidewalks, still breathing its night air. With that mythology came exaggeration. Stories grew larger than reality. Small actions became symbolic. John understood this better than anyone. He knew that once a narrative took hold, facts mattered less than belief. And belief, once formed, was almost impossible to undo. Law enforcement attention intensified further, though it remained largely quiet. John sensed it in subtle ways. Familiar routes suddenly feeling observed, routines feeling heavier. He responded by becoming even more predictable, even more visible. If people were watching, he wanted them to see consistency, not secrecy. Some advised caution, others urged restraint. John listened, but he trusted his instincts. They had carried him this far. He believed that retreat would invite suspicion, and suspicion could unravel everything. So he stayed the course, polished and composed. Inside his circle, loyalty deepened, but so did fear. Not fear of John, but fear of the moment. Everyone understood that eras don't last forever. Stability, once achieved, becomes something people fight to protect. John felt that tension in the air, like electricity before a storm. There were nights when he stood alone near a window, looking out at the city lights stretching endlessly in every direction. Each light represented a life, a story, a future unfolding. He wondered how many of those lives would one day remember his name, and in what tone. Respect, curiosity, warning. Despite everything, John felt a sense of pride. He had risen from nothing, shaped his fate with confidence and will. Few could deny that. Whether history would judge him kindly was another matter entirely. The press began circling closer, asking sharper questions. John answered calmly, carefully. He never rushed. He never appeared defensive. He understood that image was now inseparable from reality. To lose one was to lose both. And yet, beneath the surface confidence, something else stirred. A quiet awareness that the story was entering a new chapter, one where control would be tested more than ever before. Power, once fully visible, attracts forces determined to challenge it. John Gotti adjusted his jacket, stepped back into the glow of the city, and continued forward. He had learned long ago that hesitation was a luxury he couldn't afford. The city watched him now, wide awake, waiting to see what would happen next. The city's attention had a different texture now. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was expectation. John Gotti felt it in the way questions were framed, in the pauses that followed his answers, in the way people leaned forward when he entered a room. He had become a focal point, a figure people projected their assumptions onto. Some saw confidence, others saw challenge. John saw responsibility. He adjusted by refining his routines. Mornings became more structured. Afternoons were filled with conversations that required patience and precision. Evenings stretched long, often ending with quiet reflection rather than celebration. He understood that leadership at this level wasn't about enjoying the spotlight. It was about managing its heat. The press, now bolder, tried to capture him as a symbol of something larger, new. York's contradictions wrapped in a tailored suit. John never corrected them. He knew that denying a story sometimes made it stronger. Instead, he offered calm, measured presence. If people wanted a character, he would give them composure. Within his circle, the mood shifted again. Loyalty was strong, but anxiety crept in around the edges. Change was in the air. Everyone sensed it. The kind of change that doesn't announce itself until it's already arrived. John became the steady center others looked to when uncertainty pressed close. He spent time reinforcing connections, not through grand gestures, but through consistency. He showed up when he said he would. He listened when others spoke. He made decisions and stood by them. In a world where doubt could unravel everything, certainty became a gift. At home, the contrast grew sharper. John tried to protect his family from the weight he carried, but children are perceptive. They notice when a parent's smile takes effort, when silence lingers longer than usual. He reassured them with routines, with warmth, with presence. In those moments, he was not a figure of influence. He was simply a father, grounding himself in what mattered most. As months passed, the pressure didn't ease, it concentrated. Events began to align in ways John recognized as pivotal. Conversations that once felt hypothetical became immediate. Decisions once deferred demanded resolution. The room for error narrowed. John approached these moments with deliberate calm. He believed that panic revealed weakness, and weakness invited challenge. He spoke less, listened more, and chose his words with care. Those around him took cues from his demeanor. If John remained composed, others followed suit. Public attention intensified. Photographs appeared. Stories circulated. John became a familiar image to people who had never met him. He understood the danger of that kind of recognition, but he also understood its power. Visibility, if managed, could become a shield as much as a spotlight. Law enforcement pressure remained persistent but measured. John stayed predictable, grounded in routine. He believed that consistency told its own story, one of normalcy, not concealment. He didn't flaunt anything. He simply existed openly, confident that fear would only betray him. There were nights when he walked alone, letting the city's noise wash over him. The hum of traffic, the echo of footsteps, the distant laughter drifting out of open doors. New York was alive in a way few cities ever were, and John felt deeply connected to it. This city had shaped him, tested him, elevated him. In return, it demanded resilience. He thought about legacy more often now, not in grand terms, but in practical ones. How would his choices echo? What would remain when the attention moved on? He believed that leadership meant building something that outlasted the moment. Whether history would see it that way was beyond his control. The tension reached a quiet peak, a sense that the next step, whatever it was, would define everything that followed. John didn't rush it. He understood that timing could turn risk into opportunity, or opportunity into regret. When the moment finally arrived, it felt almost understated.
No dramática non semen, no saden upheaval.
Just a shift so clear that everyone felt it at once. John stepped into it with the same confidence he had always carried, aware that the spotlight had narrowed and brightened. He didn't celebrate. He didn't hesitate. He simply accepted the weight and moved forward. Outside, the city kept breathing, unaware of how many lines had just been crossed, how many paths had quietly converged. John Gotti walked through the night, steady and composed, knowing that the story had entered its most demanding chapter yet. And still, his stride did not change. The first time John Gotti realized the story had begun to write itself without his permission, it wasn't in a courtroom or on a street corner. It was in the way strangers smiled at him like they already knew him. New York had turned him into a headline-sized mystery. People who'd never spoken to him had opinions about him. Taxi drivers mentioned him in passing. Waiters leaned a little closer, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever made him him. Even the air around him felt different, charged with the strange electricity that comes when a private life becomes public theater. John didn't hate it. That surprised him sometimes. A quieter man might have felt hunted by attention. John felt sharpened by it. He understood the city's love for a character, and he knew how to hold a room the way a performer holds a stage. He dressed the part, moved with composure, and offered the world a steady face that said, "I'm not afraid of you." But beneath the calm, a second story was unfolding. One that didn't care about suits or smiles. Pressure was building. Not loud pressure, not obvious pressure. The kind that comes from persistence, from patience, from people whose job is to watch and wait. John sensed it the way you sense an approaching storm before the first drop falls, by the shift in temperature, the heaviness in the sky. He couldn't point to one thing. It was a collection of small signals. The same faces appearing too often, questions that felt too precise, the way certain routes started to feel like they had invisible mirrors on every corner. He responded the way he always did, by becoming more deliberate, more routine, more calm. If you never look rattled, people struggle to prove you are. And then, as if the city itself wanted to test that calm, came the courtroom years. They arrived in waves, each one bringing its own tension. The courthouse steps became a kind of daily stage. Cameras, reporters, microphones pushed forward like curious birds. John walked through it with steady confidence, greeting the moment as if it were an appointment he'd scheduled. People started calling him a nickname that sounded half like praise and half like disbelief. A man who seemed to slip away from consequences like rain sliding off a smooth surface. John heard it and didn't correct it. Inside the courtroom, life moved to a different rhythm. Time slowed. Words became careful. Every expression seemed to matter. John sat with his posture straight, his face composed, as if the entire room were simply another place to prove steadiness. He didn't let the tension show. Even when the air felt tight, even when eyes turned sharply in his direction, he gave back the same calm look. At home, the courthouse drama felt less like theater and more like exhaustion. His family lived with the constant hum of uncertainty. Phone calls, updates, rumors, all of it threaded through ordinary life. Dinner still happened, birthdays still came, but the quiet moments carried an extra weight, like everyone was holding a breath they couldn't fully release. John tried to protect them from that weight. He was warm when he could be, present when he could be. He spoke with reassurance that sounded almost casual, the way you might reassure someone about a late train. "It'll be fine. Don't worry. We'll get through it." He believed those words, at least in the moment he said them. The strange thing about living in the spotlight is how quickly it normalizes. John became used to the attention the way you get used to city noise. At first it keeps you awake, then one day you realize you can sleep right through it. He walked through flashbulbs and questions as if they were weather. He didn't run. He didn't hide. He simply continued. And for a while, that approach seemed to work. But a story can change with one decision, especially when someone inside the circle begins to look at the world differently. John started to notice subtle changes in the people around him. Not everyone, not all at once, but enough to register. Some grew quieter. Some seemed tense in ways they hadn't been before. The laughter didn't always reach the eyes. Conversations ended faster when someone unexpected entered the room. People who once spoke with confidence began choosing their words more carefully, like they were trying not to leave fingerprints on the air. John watched all of it, storing impressions the way he always had. He didn't accuse. He didn't confront. He simply observed. Loyalty had always been his foundation, but he understood a hard truth. Loyalty can be worn down by fear, and fear can be fed by uncertainty. The longer pressure lingered, the more it tested people's nerves. Not everyone had the same tolerance for waiting. One evening, John sat alone in a quiet room, the kind of quiet that feels almost too clean, too still. He stared at nothing for a long moment, thinking about how strange it was to be both admired and surrounded by tension at the same time. He was famous now in a way he hadn't aimed for, and yet, fame didn't bring peace. It brought exposure. He thought about his children, not their faces exactly, but their futures. What would they inherit from his choices?
Bride,
Burden? A name that carried stories before they'd even spoken their own? Outside, the city kept moving, indifferent and alive. Somewhere, a couple laughed on a sidewalk. Somewhere, a bus sighed to a stop. Somewhere, a radio played a song that sounded like the past. John listened to the faint soundtrack of New York and felt, for the first time in a while, the edge of fatigue. The next chapter didn't begin with a shout. It began with a shift. The atmosphere around him tightened, not in a way that could be proved by pointing to a single event, but in the way a room tightens when everyone has heard the same rumor and no one wants to say it out loud. John noticed a careful distance in certain interactions. He noticed how quickly some people ended conversations. He noticed how a few smiles looked practiced instead of natural. And then, a new case formed around him, not as a sudden ambush, but as the culmination of patience. This time felt different. The questions were sharper, the stakes heavier, the tone more certain. John still walked with the same steady stride, still wore the same crisp suits, still met the camera's eye without flinching. But inside, he understood. This wasn't just another wave. This was the ocean pulling back before a larger surge. The courtroom returned, but now the air felt thicker. People watched with a different kind of focus. Reporters didn't ask if the story would turn. They asked when. The nickname followed him like a shadow, but shadows don't protect you. They only prove the light is there. John's composure held. It always did. He sat, listened, spoke when necessary, kept his face calm. He refused to give the world a glimpse of panic. But behind the scenes, the pressure wasn't just coming from outside anymore. One of the most painful lessons in any life, especially a life built on trust, is realizing that someone close to you may be carrying their own private storm. John began to sense that a key figure near him was no longer simply enduring the pressure. That person was changing under it, becoming more inward, more guarded, like someone standing at a crossroads they hadn't expected to reach. John didn't name it aloud, even in his own mind. Naming a fear gives it shape. John preferred to keep fear shapeless. Still, he felt it. The days moved forward with the slow, heavy rhythm of inevitability. Court sessions, quiet conversations, 1,000 tiny moments that felt like chess moves made in a fog. Outside, the public watched and speculated. Some treated it like entertainment. Others treated it like a morality play. John treated it like life because it was. At home, the tension turned into a kind of quiet endurance. His family continued their routines because routines were a way to hold the world together when it wanted to slip apart. John tried to be gentle there. He tried to be normal. But sometimes, late at night when the household was asleep, he would sit with the silence and feel the weight of all the things he could not say. There is a loneliness that comes with being the symbol. People project strength onto you until they forget you are human. John rarely let anyone see cracks, and so the world assumed there were none. But in those late-night hours, alone with the dim light of a lamp and the distant hum of traffic, he felt the cost of carrying a persona that never blinked. And then the shift finally revealed itself. A trusted figure, someone once firmly anchored, made a choice that changed the shape of everything. Not in a dramatic, cinematic moment, but in a quiet decision made under pressure, in the private space where fear and survival argue with loyalty. John felt it first as a change in atmosphere before he understood it as fact. The air around him seemed to thin, like the room had lost oxygen. Conversations that once felt stable now felt precarious. He realized, with a clarity that was almost cold, that the story had moved into a phase where control was no longer purely his. In the courtroom, the tone shifted again. Confidence still sat on John's shoulders, but now it was being tested by something more complicated than public scrutiny. Something intimate. Something that reached into the inner circle. John's face remained calm. His posture remained straight. He kept the same steady gaze. If anyone watched him closely, they would have seen no tremor. That was his gift and his armor. But inside, something settled. A quiet understanding that the era of slipping through storms might be ending, not because he had lost his composure, but because the weather itself had changed. That night, he left the courthouse and walked into the city's glow. the flash of cameras reflecting in his eyes for a moment like distant fireworks. He didn't hurry. He didn't look down. He didn't offer the world anything except what he always had. The image of a man who believed he could outlast the pressure. New York watched him go, restless and captivated, sensing the story nearing its most fateful turn. And in the hush between the city's noises, as if the world were pausing to listen, the next chapter waited, quiet, certain, and close. The final chapter didn't arrive like a door slamming. It arrived like winter, slowly at first, then all at once until you looked around and realized the landscape had changed. John Gotti had always believed in the power of presence. If you stood tall, looked people in the eye, moved like you belonged, the world often treated you accordingly. For years, that belief had carried him through storms that would have bent other men. But now the storm was different. It wasn't just noise outside. It was pressure that had found its way into the inner rooms, the places where trust lived. He didn't speak about it much, even privately. John had never been someone who processed fear out loud. He carried it like a hidden weight, tucked behind tailored confidence and practiced calm. But as the months tightened, he began to understand something deeper than strategy. No matter how strong you are, you cannot control every human heart around you. The courthouse steps had become familiar. Cameras popped like distant fireworks. Reporters clustered as if they were standing outside a theater waiting for the show to begin. John walked past them with the same steady rhythm, the same composed face, the same message without words. I'm still here. I'm not rattled. Inside, the air felt heavier than it ever had. Not because the room was louder, but because the silence between words carried more meaning. The case itself moved like a slow machine, methodical, careful, patient. And John, who had built his world on reading rooms, could feel the direction of that machine even when no one said it outright. He sat beside his lawyers, calm and attentive. His expression never betrayed the work happening behind his eyes. People watching might have mistaken that for arrogance. Those who knew him better would have understood it differently. John was not the kind of man who surrendered emotionally in public. He believed dignity was a weapon. Even in a situation he couldn't fully control, he could still control how he looked, how he carried himself, how he was remembered. Outside the courtroom, the public treated the story like a legend. Some spoke about him with a kind of cinematic fascination. Others spoke in warnings. John heard the rumors, the nicknames, the endless speculation. He didn't correct people. He had learned long ago that once a narrative existed, fighting it only fed it. At home, the story felt nothing like a legend. It felt like quiet tension at the dinner table, like soft conversations after the kids went to sleep, like the way his family tried to live normally even as the world insisted on being extraordinary. John tried to be gentle there. He tried to be warm. He tried to build a little island of normal life inside the storm. Sometimes he succeeded. Sometimes the storm followed him through the door anyway. There were nights when he sat in a living room with the lights turned low, hearing nothing but the hum of the refrigerator and the faraway sound of traffic. In those nights, he didn't think about headlines. He thought about time, about how quickly children grow, about how easy it is to assume you'll always be around for the next holiday, the next birthday, the next ordinary day that quietly becomes precious later. John never apologized for who he was. He didn't know how. In his world, apologizing was often confused with weakness. But he did what he could do. He showed up. He hugged his children a little longer. He listened more closely. He tried, in his own way, to leave love behind in the moments he still had. And then the turning point became undeniable. The case reached a place where the room's energy changed. Not with shouting, not with drama, but with a steady, unmistakable certainty. John felt it. The lawyers felt it. The spectators felt it. It was the feeling of a path narrowing until there was only one direction left. In that moment, John's face remained calm, but inside, something quiet shifted. Not panic, not collapse, something closer to acceptance. An understanding that the story he had written for years was now approaching an ending he couldn't negotiate with. He was convicted and sentenced to spend the rest of his life in prison. If the public expected a spectacle, they didn't get one. John did not melt down or plead for sympathy. He stood with the same posture he always had, holding onto the one kind of control still available: composure. Even then, he seemed determined to tell the world, "You can change my circumstances, but you cannot take my dignity." And then the city moved on in the way cities do. Headlines shifted to newer stories. Cameras found fresh faces. New York continued its endless conversation with itself. But John's absence left a strange echo. 4 years, he had been a visible character in the city's mythology. Now, he became a memory shaped by fragments: photographs, stories, opinions, and the lingering question of how one man could be both so admired and so doomed by the very visibility that made him famous. Inside prison, life slowed into routine. Days measured by schedules, not momentum. The world that once felt wide as the city became small as a corridor. John carried himself with the same pride, though pride inside a confined world becomes a different kind of thing: less performance, more survival. He kept his routines. He held on to what he could: his name, his identity, his belief that reputation mattered even when no one was watching. He stayed connected to family as best he could. And for him, that connection was not a weakness. It was proof that he still mattered beyond the headlines, that he was still a father, still a husband, still a man whose life, however complicated, had threads of love woven through it. Years passed. Health, which once felt like an afterthought to a man driven by momentum, became impossible to ignore. The body has its own timeline, and it does not negotiate with pride. John's world narrowed further, not by attention or courts, but by something simpler and more human: illness. In 2002, John Gotti died in prison from throat cancer. The news traveled quickly, as it always did in a city that never forgets its famous names. People reacted in different ways. Some felt closure. Some felt fascination. Some felt nothing at all because time had already carried them into other stories. But whether people mourned him or judged him, they remembered him. And that is the strange, final power of a life lived in the spotlight. It becomes bigger than the person who lived it. If you step back and look at John Gotti's story without the noise, it becomes something quieter and more universal than headlines might suggest. It becomes a story about choices, about how confidence can build a life and also build a trap, about how image can protect you until the moment it doesn't, about how being seen can feel like strength, right up until it becomes exposure. It's also a story about contradictions. A man who loved his family deeply while living a life that brought storms to their doorstep. A man who craved respect so intensely that he became a symbol of it, only to learn that symbols are easier to celebrate than they are to live as. Tonight, as you settle into sleep, imagine New York in the quiet hours again. The street lights humming, the storefront gates pulled down, the city breathing softly, carrying 1,000 stories that will never be written down. Somewhere in that vast, restless place, John Gotti's footsteps still echo, not as a celebration, not as a warning alone, but as a reminder that every life, no matter how loud, eventually becomes a story told in the dark. And the city, as always, keeps breathing.